So I'm pretty excited to introduce our next guest. For 30 years, she was an executive at both CBC Kids and TVO. She now serves as a professor at Ryerson, as well as an advocate and champion of the inclusion of research in children's media. Please welcome to the program, Kim Wilson. We gifted you a talk show
Fantastic.
today.
I've always wanted one.
Finally.
Great.
How are you this morning?
I'm fantastic. We're going to talk about animated shows. I'm super excited.
Yeah, but if you could, even long before your illustrious career, could you bring us back to you as a youth? What were you drawn to Saturday mornings? What did you watch, like cartoon-wise?
You know, I think at the start, one of my favorite things was all of those amazing shorts in Sesame Street.
Right.
You know, they were genius. I think what Sesame Street did was genius in essence, because how Joan Cans Cooney did that whole thing was built on development of kids and kids watching content. And what they were so excited about at the time was watching commercials, because commercials were these jam-packed segments that had music, they had entertainment, they were often animated. And so why not build that into something where kids can learn? So I think for me at the start, I loved all of those hilarious segments. I remember so many of them. The Pointer Singers, you know, were singing about counting on a, pinball arcade machine. There was just such a range. So of all of the things I remember watching when I was young, those Sesame Street animated segments, I think were genius and brilliant. And I think that was part of, kind of what got me excited about content in the first place.
Today we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive in sex in cartoons and the sexualization of both female and male characters in animation. And I mean, all the things that you were doing in your career and presently is for the research and basically inclusion of all things in children's media. And I feel like you've seen a lot in 30 years. You've seen not just pitches for shows and shows themselves, but like the network and the development and where it was going, where it started, where you jumped in, and how it changed for 30 years. So like thinking about that subject, sex in animation, even in like kids animation, this is the first time kids are watching cartoons and seeing little boys and little girl characters, or the importance of like where they're at in that level. Like how important is that, and like what have you seen?
Well, I've seen so much. I think there's definitely been an evolution. And what happens in culture impacts what happens on screens. So we've seen a lot of change. I think there's been more rapid change actually in the last handful of years than in a long time prior to that. And that's because, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd's death, in Canada, Indigenous children's graves being found, like all of those things have had impact in people thinking, ooh, we have to think differently about things. I think there was actually a very long time where things moved very, very slowly. So I'm super optimistic now because I see way more change in the last 5 years in terms of making differences. But in regards to what impact content has on kids, it is unbelievable the impact it has in terms of shaping future relationships, how, self-esteem, what they think they can be, what their career is going to be. So what you might watch at 3, 4, 7, 8, it's not just for entertainment. I mean, although that's awesome too, but it's also impactful in terms of shaping your entire life. And I know that sounds deep and heady, wow, it is. But, when we think about sexualization of characters, quite clearly, if girls are watching characters that are over-sexualized, we have tons of research to support this. It impacts their self-esteem, body image. It can lead to eating disorders, depression, anxiety, potentially self-harm, seeing themselves as sexual objects and, self-objectifying. It can lead to, a greater acceptance of date violence, of, sexual aggression towards them. Like, those are all unbelievable impacts, but it's that first piece. It's the, who's that child going to be? And what we put on is going to influence who that child's going to be. And it's not to say it's all terrible, but sometimes repetitive messages and imaging can have some really long-term negative impact, especially if you're not watching where a parent might chat with you about it.
Right.
If parents are talking to you about something afterwards, I mean, you have a 5-year-old son. If he's watching something, a program on air, and you see something that you think might be a little bit sketchy, you're going to say, oh, what did you think about,
you break it down to him.
Absolutely.
You explain to him like, hey, like what were your feelings feelings on that, if any, and then really give them the truth.
Yeah.
And
Engaging in conversation has a huge impact. So, the shows on their own, if they have these kind of negative stereotypes, it obviously makes kids think, oh, that's who I'm supposed to be. That's who I can be. And it's for boys too. There's this entire, area of looking at kind of the masculinity of characters, hypersexualized masculinity, and boys who think they have to be tough and strong and do it all and, make the money. And, also how they might perceive, even in those stereotypical images of girls, how it also might impact them later in life. There's men who have trouble finding relationships because they have watched so much content where there's over-sexualization of girls. In particular, if you're watching a lot of anime, where you see these prepubescent girls who are super sexualized and have those unrealistic shapes and sizes and are submissive, etc., 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 you might have some skewed ideas of what relationships are and what's going to happen when you get out there in the real world, because that's what you've seen over and over and over again. Repetition has value when you see it. Oh, I see it in this show. I see it in this show. I see it in this show, right?
It's funny in its simplest form, and as an executive of animation, you probably can agree or identify. It's like, oh, we have, maybe just to even save on a couple bucks, here's the design of Mickey Mouse, and here's Minnie, who's exactly like Mickey, and the only difference is the polka dot dress and the bow. And suddenly, if you're watching that as a female young viewer, like, oh, I always must have a bow in my hair. Oh, it can only be identified as a girl if I have a dress on, whereas it's not really like that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some great things happening, just on what you're talking about with dresses. We've seen in our most recent study, which was on animation in Canada for kids, we've seen half of the characters now, girl characters now, are wearing pants or tights under their dresses and skirts. So there's some real positive change. But there's also been some shows over the years that have done such a big job reinforcing certain imagery that kids will remember and will have impact.
Yeah, we've talked about possible negative outlooks. Are there any positive ones, even in the past, that you saw that were trying to be ahead of the game?
There's just so many. Like, there's so many positive kids shows now. What I love is when kids, worlds are represented on screen. So if you, to feel good about yourself, you want to see yourself reflected on screen. You want to not just see yourself, but you want to hear yourself too, right? So the voice matters also. People don't focus on that enough, but you want to hear people that talk the way you talk, cadence, accent, if that's, relevant, that sort of thing. So there's a bunch of things we want to be seeing that we now see. So a show that I can point to is 16 Hudson, which is a show from Amazing Studio, Big Bad Boo Studios in BC. And, it's an apartment building. There's kids from all, walks of life, all different backgrounds, girls who are interested in science, or, like all of those kind of breaking of the gender stereotypes. So when I see shows like that, I get super excited, because that is what the world looks like. And kids aren't living in the country. They're not living in middle income family homes in suburbia with a driveway and 2 children. They're living in apartment buildings. They're living in, semi-detached homes in the cities. So we want to see who kids are. We want to see, for kids, media is really a mirror and a window. Now kids, who have that background are so excited to see themselves reflected and feel so empowered. Race, gender, disabilities, LGBTQ2S+, these are the areas that I'm excited, where a show like 16 Hudson or The Bravest Knight, which has gay dads, this is the world we live in. So to see that reflected on screens is unbelievable. That, to me, that's a game changer.
So we're talking about the inclusion of characters on screen, but it's not so much even now, with all the progress we've made, that we are including characters on screen, but they're properly represented behind the scenes. What can you say, being an advisor now to young creators and executives and seeing the next generation, and what are you noticing?
It's really positive, because now we're getting way more work in terms of saying, hey, can you help us make sure we're presenting girls in the right way, boys in the right way, people of different diverse backgrounds and abilities in the right way. So that's a really positive sign. But I think about it, I go back to one of the most evil, over-sexualized characters of all time, Jessica Rabbit.
Save me, save me. What? Save me!
Oh.
And, you know, she said, I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
Right.
And it really makes me think of one of the problems has been, or one of the challenges is probably a better way of saying it, who is drawing that character, who is behind the scenes.
Right.
And what we're actually seeing is that that's where we have a big problem. So, you know, 25% of the directors and producers of kids shows are women, and the rest are, you know, it's predominantly white men. You know, it harkens back to the days of Disney, when Disney in the late 30s and early 40s would not hire women. They said, we only hire young men.
Yeah.
So just for a moment, let's take a moment and think. You have a bunch of young men in a room and they're designing characters. How are they going to make them look? And I think, you know, that has carried on year after year, because when there are predominantly, you know, young white men, and not to diss young white men who are awesome, but when it's just that one group behind the scenes, you know, time and time again, you're not getting a broader representation of women or of different cultures or abilities or sexuality, you know, how people identify, all of those things. So that's definitely a problem. I think the stats now are about 60% of the people in animation school are women, and yet still it's 20% who are actually in, you know, impactful animation roles. So I think that plays a role. The behind the scenes is critical.
And I know what you're talking about. I've worked on the other side of the microphone. I'm a voiceover artist now, but I worked as a character layout artist in various animation studios. And yeah, it was definitely a boys' club. I mean, that was like 1999, you know, when I first started. And I love to see what's been happening now. Love to see more power going to, you know, where there wasn't power. And definitely more voice and authentic. You're going to get better stories and better representation that way. You know, I worked on Space Gem, and people were upset of, you know, giving Lola Bunny a bit more of a backbone than two front bones, you know? It's
and
like...
Listen, kudos to the director for realizing in the original Space Jam that Lola Bunny was unbelievably over-sexualized, because she was. And here was this thing, she had all these amazing things about her. And I would love to point out that you can make a character who's, you know, kick-ass and smart and all of these awesome things, but if you present her like Lola Bunny with the long eyelashes, blinking, 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 and, you know, the tight, you know, crop top, it's sending mixed messages. And what kids often see is the message of, this is how I should look. And it's funny because Space Jam's a really great example of, you know, it's a kid's movie.
Right.
And yet, you know, so we've done a lot over the years in terms of, how do we make, you know, content appeal to adults as well. That's always been an issue. And I think that really comes out of the beginning of television. When we first started, you know, television launched, and all of a sudden it's like, where are we getting all the content? So it's similar to when the 24-hour networks launched and when the streaming services launched. There's this like, oh my gosh, we need content. And at the beginning, when television, you know, was first a thing, it was like, well, where are we getting this? So there was a lot of the content for a general audience, like Bugs Bunny. Mickey Mouse is another one. And they said, oh, quick, we can quickly turn these, and so kids will like them too. But they still left all those elements in that, you know, some people call them crumbs for mums. All the little moments and the jokes and stuff, they're often in there. And that has impact because it's taken a long time for people to start to think about, you know, maybe more so in preschool animation, but, you know, that we don't need to have these in necessarily.
There really was no, like, place or really need or, like, point to have, like, oh, we need a over-sexualized basketball bunny girl. And I don't know. Clearly, I'm happy that she changed for the better.
Yeah, me too, because now she's, you know, she's all about teamwork. She's awesome, right? Like, these are the characters that we need to see. She's still cool. She still looks like a girl. She's still gorgeous. She's still all these amazing things, but it's all wrapped in this package that's a broad range of characteristics.
When did you detect and when did you see a change in the sexualization of characters across the board?
Well, I'm slightly biased, having worked at 2 public broadcasters, so it's always been something, and I'm probably a bit, I mean, I do research now, so I'm a bit of a geek for, like, the impact it has, you know, but we have to remember that animation is a business, and people want to make money, so, you know, I think that's where sometimes there's been the struggle of, I care, but we need to make money. And so I think in the last 10 years been more thought about it. How could those two things maybe come together in a positive way? We can still make an amazing show, but we can change some of the behaviors. And I'm trying to think of a good example of shows I've seen. Oh, okay. So one of my favorite shows is Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why I love that show. Well, there's many reasons. It's a cool show. Love this, everything. But one of the great things is, what do we see when we see relationships on screen? We see a lot of male-led relationship, or inappropriate relationships. Going back to Betty Boop. Do you remember in the early Betty Boop stuff? It's like she had a moment or two where she was a feminist when she pushed off some advances. So it's like, but mostly you see, in the Disney movies, you see this amazing amount of, I'm singing in the garden and talking about a boy and butterflies. We don't need that, right? And
the damsel in distress.
The damsel in distress, and here's the hero coming to rescue me. So one of the things I love about Avatar: The Last Airbender, so Katara and Aang. So Aang is interested in Katara, and he expresses interest, and she's basically like, I'm not interested in you right now. And then Aang respectfully backs off and doesn't pursue her. And then later on in the series, she decides she's interested. She develops feelings for him, and she acts on that. Mm-hmm. So here we have a situation where the female is leading. The female is not submissive to the male character, where the male character is not inappropriately pushing in a way that's not respectful. So to me, that's teaching healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, and that shows amazing, right? So I think partly people have this perception, if we have to think about all these things, it's going to be so pedantic. Educational consultants are going to ruin the show. It's like all these things. No, the more you know about kids and the amazing impact you can have, that's what I want to see in my boy characters. I want to see boys who are partners with women. I want to see boys who have a range of emotions and aren't, let's talk about shapes for a second. I don't want to see the boys who are triangles and the women who are hourglass shaped. The triangular boys, think about all the superheroes, animated Batman, so wide at the top, chiseled chest, tight in the middle, totally unrealistic for boys as much as all the kind of princess imagery is for girls. Mm-hmm. So, it's better when we see boys who have a range, who can show that, I can be a partner to you. I don't have to always be in the lead. It's amazing when we see characters like Magic School Bus. Who doesn't love Magic School Bus? Classic. There's a female teacher who loves science, adventure, and learning. There's girl characters who love astronomy. There's a tomboy. There's a boy who's afraid of everything. Wow, what a nice change from what we normally see. So it's huge, awesome impact.
Realistic relationships. This is how it should be.
Well, I love to do this exercise. I talk about this all the time. When you're thinking about this, how you sexualize characters, boys and girls, men and women, one of the cool things to do in animation is to look at the characters as a silhouette. So if you look at Disney princesses, for example, as silhouettes over the years, right away you see that is not a normal size and shape. It's quite obvious. We should be looking at silhouettes to see, are we designing characters that are interesting on their own, that don't need to have all those elements? So I think of The Simpsons as a great example. You do, silhouettes of those characters. They look very interesting. They have cool, that says something, rather than seeing all these ones that are kind of,
the cookie cutter,
the Disney
kind of
princess model, right? So a lot of kids have grown up in a lot of generations watching Disney princesses. There's a study, this one's a little while ago, before they started adding, girls of color, characters, lead characters in their movies, like Moana and that sort of thing. But they showed girls around the world, or had girls all around the world, and they asked them, what does a princess look like? No matter what country girls were from, they drew pictures of white women with blonde hair. So what does that say to a girl who's living in India, who's living in Japan? It says, I cannot be a Disney princess because I don't look like that. So I can never be this amazing thing that I would love to be.
Going through pilots and trying out for different shows, there are definitely some shows that I have been a part of where the lead of the show was a female, character, was not like the straight A student, was a bit more of an art rebel. And, the corporation in North America thought, yeah, this is cool. But then, of course, we have to look, at the rest of the world where the other corporations, Euro Corporation, Asia Corporation exists, and how they accept that. And they're like, there's no way that could be our corporate princess. she's a flunky and likes to do art. How are we going to teach that to our young female audiences? So on that scale, and again, as your experience as a veteran in this field, what are your thoughts on that? Where it's like we're trying so hard to correct it up here, but our neighbors across the pond aren't into these ideas.
I think business is always going to be a challenge, how to collaborate with countries around the world. And there are slight cultural differences. And yet, we've seen these powerhouse shows, look at Paw Patrol, Peppa Pig, that travel the world. So there are some core values that are shared. I don't think we have to go to the, lowest common denominator. And, we have seen that. Like, I can think of examples in shows where I'm so excited in some ways, and then I'm like, ugh. So, Powerpuff Girls. Awesome, superhero, woo!
Saving the world before bedtime.
Save the world. Oh, right. And then there's the secretary, Cerebellum, and we only see her, from here. You see her little, locks, and you see she's super testicular. She has a high-raised skirt. And while someone could argue, oh, she's so smart and clever, she's always outwitting the mayor and getting what she wants, good for her. What am I actually seeing? I'm seeing this over-sexualized character who, makes me think she's using her sexual identity for power. Oh, as a girl, is that what I should be doing?
Right.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, super awesome character. April O'Neil, she's a reporter, she's great. Everybody loves her, she's kick-ass, she's fantastic. Oh, but we had to put her in a nice yellow, tight jumpsuit because, probably for the male gaze, right? Which is that term of expressing how we make content, for kind of a heteronormative, heterosexual male. We objectify women for the pleasure of men. And there's a male gaze component in quite a few shows, and that speaks to this whole, making a little part for adults as well.
I was saying before, I can't wait to see the day where there's 4 sisters as the Ninja Turtles as opposed to the 4 brothers, just to shake things up.
Would be awesome. I would watch that.
Yeah. And have a bumbling reporter, male reporter, instead of April and
yes,
a guy in little short shorts running around the city of New York. If we could go back to, and talk a bit about Jessica Rabbit, because clearly, Roger Rabbit, although is a cartoon, definitely has some adult subject matter, not necessarily like a rated G movie. So it kind of does speak a little bit more to the adult audience, which may have a bit of a different perspective and may have gotten more of the jokes that maybe flew over the kids' heads. Could you kind of go through the difference between what it means as an impact on children, a character like Jessica Rabbit, versus, an adult audience?
Yeah, adults can think things through and they have experience outside of that they can relate to. Although I think, by the way, repetitive images of sexual objectification obviously have long-term impact, in particular, on men who see women objectified a certain way time and time and time again. And, research does show that there are impacts in terms of how men or even women are in their partnered relationships in terms of aggressive harassment, all of the things that we've been talking about. But I think kids are very different. And one of the challenges with how we see kind of this sexualization of characters is that when you're looking at characters, we always look and we talk quite a bit about, oh, look at the hourglass figure, look at the huge breasts, look at those eyelashes. And so when you give eyelashes to women and make them dark, what you're doing is sexualizing them and sending messages and images about makeup is important, how you look is important. It's way deeper than just, so I think it's an easy out. Let's make this a female character. Toss us some eyelashes, woohoo! We all have eyelashes, for goodness sakes. But I think there's so many things we have to think about. Jessica Rabbit, she has lots of power. There's so many great things about her character. However, kids are looking at all the things. How does the character look and how they behave? But in that whole area of how do they look, it's not just what they wear, it's also how are they posing? How are they responding to, another character? How is the camera shooting them? All of those things, poses, shooting style, all have an impact. So it's hard when there's mixed messages. You have to remember that kids are getting information from all of the pieces. They're not just saying, like an adult would, well, it's okay because Jessica Rabbit's a, really strong female character. She's empowered, she's leading, or whatever whatever the character is doing on any of these shows, the kids are seeing all of the elements.
Yeah.
And they are all together sending messages and images. So that's what's important. And preschoolers, by the way, only watch screens 50% of the time. So, how they, what they're saying and how they're saying it is also important. So, I mean, I think that it's critical to look at the whole picture. You can't compartmentalize for kids and say, but we wrote this character this way, because all of those other factors play such a critical role too.
No, in a case like Powerpuff Girls and something like Animaniacs that have both had reboots, those sexualized characters have disappeared.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the change of the times. In my ideal world, do we ever have characters who you couldn't actually be in real life because you'd have to, cut yourself just like, no, I would like to see characters who look like kids, who are reflective. I was so excited when Dora the Explorer was launched. That was the first character. I think that was a moment of change where there was a character, on top of, having a Spanish character, a Spanish-speaking character, and all of these kinds of things, she looked like what a toddler or preschooler looked like. And it's an empowering experience for kids to see those characters. But, I think there'll be a lot of reboots where, again, getting back to a business model, when something has worked in the past, Carmen Sandiego's another one, you want to bring it back because one, you're going to get that legacy audience, the parents who are now have children and they loved it when they were growing up. It's a great business model, but you have to change with the times because the world has changed.
So what do you see as the outlook for the future of sex in animation?
I'm going to tell you, I'm positive. I think people are learning. Yeah, and when you see characters that are working, I love the Dragon Prince on Netflix. I love that character, General Amaya. She's a kick-ass female leader of the army. She probably is a lesbian. She's deaf, and instead of focusing on, oh my gosh, deaf, where it's like that focus, it's integrated. It makes the stories richer. The fact that she's deaf, the fact that it's just an amazing character. And I think the more we see characters that are great, even as creators who are watching, it will inspire you and say, hey, you can make that happen. I think there's a real motion happening now, and it feels like there's change. Make sure we're presenting girls in the right way, boys in the right way, people of different diverse backgrounds and abilities in the right way. So that's a really positive sign. The bigger challenge will be to make that change behind the screens, but there's definitely change happening. I'm the eternal optimist, really, so it's going to happen.
Thank goodness for you. Our guest today has been Kim Wilson. Thank you so much for enlightening us, for your knowledge and your years and years and years of experience. Thank you so much.
It's been a blast, and I can't wait for our animated show.
Awesome.